Good afternoon, everyone. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land we're on today. So the Bunburan, Wurundjeri, and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And I want to pay my respect to all of the elders past, present, emerging. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here and have a conversation with two very inspiring Vietnamese Australians who have reshaping their ways and their life in Australia in their very own unique way. So joining us here are Celia, a leader in community engagement and inclusion, as well as Brian Pham, a visionary tech entrepreneur behind Lightcard. We're going to deep dive into navigating Australian workplaces from public to startup world and how embracing our dual cultural heritage can unlock unique opportunities. Because we only have 30 minutes, we're going to dive right into right now. So let's begin with your story and your journey. And the first question that I would like to ask all of the panelists here is, when we think about the Australian dream, it has traditionally meant like home ownership. And for many overseas Vietnamese here, it might mean something different. So it can be career success, can be starting your own business, contributing to the community. So what does thriving in Australia mean to you? And what has really motivated you to pursue what you're doing right now? And how has the definition of thriving has evolved throughout your journey?
Happy to start. I'd just like to also thank Jenny. Kat Tao, that was wonderful, thank you. I tried to compose myself because, but big round of applause to her again, a wonderful, brave story. Thank you. It's a great question. I think, like many Vietnamese Australians who've fortunate enough to live in Australia. For me, the Australian dream was to be able to choose what I wanted to do. And that's not something my parents, like Kat Tao's parents, got to do. They were also factory workers, sewing clothes and, building that life for their children. So for us, the first generation to go to university, to be able to choose a career, I was very fortunate. My parents were a bit hands-off with my education. So they said, just do what you want to do and pursue. And that for me was the Australian dream, to be able to pursue what I wanted to do and have access to free education, although, in debt as well. But at the same time, being able to, have that freedom and the choice. And I think that is a great privilege. And I think at the same time, also having, for me, it's not about wealth, it's not about monetary wealth. I think wealth is good health, happiness, and being surrounded by loved ones. And I know a lot of you here are not with your family here, they're back in Vietnam. So I think for me, that's the great Australian dream, is to have those privileges that are so simple. Yeah.
What about you, Brian?
Cool. So if, for those of you who haven't met me, I am born in Australia, similar to many of you in this room as well. And I grew up, in a very similar way to Kat. And amazing, still trying to compose myself as well. But, I think the answer to this question for me is that it's changed a lot. And because my parents as well were war migrants that just wanted me and our family to have a better life, they were always like, we want stability for you, we want health, a home, and to be a doctor, lawyer, and engineer, But I think as time passes, you start to realize that, wow, life's really short. COVID just happened, and there are so many things across the world that we wish we could see, but we didn't have the chance. And so for me, I still think it's something that's evolving over time. But right now, especially in the gig workers economy, it's how much can you learn and how much of the world can you see? So that's my Australian Vietnamese dream.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing all of that. And I think our audience would be really interested in hearing more about your story. For you both have very unique sort of career pathway. For Brian, I definitely did a bit of a stalk, on your profiles, and you spend your time in Japan, and building your own sort of company as a global tech startup right now. And for Celia as well, you have so much experience building yourself in your career through government work, and then now with philanthropy through Scanlon Foundation too. And beside your full-time job, you're also dedicating your time building this beautiful like ecosystem and community of like the Vietnamese Australian professional network. So maybe I'll start with you first, if that's okay, Celia. So, as the co-president and founding member of Vietnamese Australian Professional Network, what is one pressing need that you see in our community that, if we address, could unlock more opportunities? And how like organization like VAPN and other organization can address that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It is a fairly new organisation. 2.5 years ago, we actually had Bao speak at the soft launch event. So it's great to see you again. And I think we've come a long way. But I think community like VAPN, we call it for short, is important for fostering those connections that a lot of us, like Kat said before, that desire for the identity, the belonging. Sometimes you feel like you're floating, not quite fitting in the Western space and not quite Vietnamese enough. And you want to find your people. And I think that the inspiration came from, the likes of the Greek community, Italian, Jewish communities who've come before us, who've been here for a long time, have really built a strong foundation in Australia in particular, and really become well-networked and have shared equity and learnings. This year marks 50 years for Vietnamese Australian settlement. We have a long way to go to be as strong, I find, as a community. I don't know if it's a trait within, the Asian culture. We're a bit more competitive. I do find the Chinese community does it really well. I think the collaborations, I think we have a lot to learn looking at our peers and lifting each other up, and have that, spaces like this are so important because you get to meet people you wouldn't otherwise meet in your typical day-to-day life. But, sorry, I forgot your first half of the question.
Is there any like particular need you feel like our community is Australian?
Oh, absolutely. I think, as I mentioned, 50 years, it's a long time for our community. We're a big community here in Australia, 300 plus strong, 300,000 plus strong. Succession is a big issue. It's coming up in our community. We've got our parents' generations, the older generations have really paved the path, set really successful businesses, are really struggling to find ways to keep that alive. The local bakery, the banh mi, the pho shop, the whatever it is, a migration agent down the road in Footscray, Springvale, they are struggling to keep up with, I guess, their age, but also finding young people who want to step up into those roles. And maybe it's about those connections that are missing. I think there's still a big divide between intergenerational links. From language is a big issue. A lot of us don't speak Vietnamese, or broken Vietnamese, and I think there's just an assumption that what do you know? You're young. So I think VIP, and it does play that middle bridge in a way to foster those generational conversations and just start to turn the dial a little bit to say, what does 50 years forward look like for Vietnamese Australians here? So I think intergeneration leadership, succession planning, and also representation in Australian, public sphere still extremely lacking, despite us being a huge population. We're still not represented in politics or media, and that slides are still very true. It's still very, stale, pale. Sorry, guys, but it's reality. I think I would hope to encourage others to consider more unconventional paths to be that face and that voice, and keep striving so that you can pave the path for the next generation.
Thanks, Celia. You touched on the unconventional part, so we'll go back to that in a second. But Brian, I think like the audience here would be really keen to know more about your story, especially like, your story behind like building Lightcard. And especially like I have one question for you is, what's the misconception about like starting a business in Australia that you have to unlearn?
So maybe almost 10 years ago, I was in university looking for a job as part of my course actually in Monash. And out of 100, CVs I sent out, barely anyone got back to me, but one company did, which was Mitsubishi in Japan. And so a 6-month internship there very quickly turned to 3.5 years across all these random corporates. But you know what? I think now, like, if it was the same thing, but it was an opportunity in Vietnam, in a heartbeat, I would have chosen Vietnam, because that's where all our family is, right? Like living in a city, and a lot of people probably watching or in this room would relate, like by yourself, making friends with people that don't speak your mother tongue. It's insane. So after all that time and now looking at, the current generation, there are so many amazing people in this room, in this whole ecosystem, creating these opportunities now. And it's such a great time to cross-pollinate and go into different areas that you're uncomfortable. Because my theory is that every time you move around, it counts as sorry, it's a bit mathsy, but it counts as an incremental increase to what I call a mobility index. And every single time you move postcodes, countries, or even job titles, it increases what that mobility index is. And that's the knowledge you transfer and learn between each workplace, each country, each generation. So for us as a community to keep doing that, it's something amazing. And I think from that decision now, almost 10 years ago, I was always into sort of that, let's be uncomfortable, let's be crazy, because that's, number one, the best time to do it. Number two, how are we going to grow? And so after working all these engineering jobs, sitting behind a computer desk for 12 hours, I realized this kind of sucks. I really didn't want to do this for the rest of my life. So I thought to myself, how could I really enjoy every day putting myself behind something that I'm passionate about? And that process involved a lot of late nights Googling and YouTubing random things, but soon finding what my passion was, which was building technology that really just helped someone. And then across those years in that journey, it's like, well, how much is it going to help someone? What does help even mean to me? And what does that mean to someone else? So yeah, I guess that's been the journey so far.
Thanks for sharing. And what I'm hearing in here is that journey, it hasn't been like a linear kind of path or anything for both of you. For you, it's you're doing thing, and that's through that journey you learn about what your passions really is. And then exactly what Katel mentioned about the alignment of heart, hands, and head. Was it? Yep, those threes. And then for Celia as well, what you're sharing about the pressing need in our community, not just the language barrier, the intergenerational trauma, and misunderstanding of each other. And I'm going back to what we just talked about, the unconventional path. So many of the overseas Vietnamese that have chat about feel pigeonholed into certain industries, even though statistically overseas Vietnamese in Australia can bring so many valuable diverse skills and perspective to the table. What I find really interesting is that there are 268,000 people of Vietnamese ancestry in Australia, so making us the 6th largest diaspora community in Australia, and over 50% of us are in the working age, so 25 to 54 years old. Vietnamese Australians have one of the highest rates of business ownership among migrant groups, with many thriving in the sector like food services, retail and tech. And for example, 15.4% of Vietnamese born Australian actually self-employed. So the national average is 10%, so that's a lot higher than the national average. What is really highlighted to me is a massive potential labour force contribution, as well as innovation and economic growth. So for both of you, what advice would you give to those wanting to pivot into less conventional fields? How can they turn their unique backgrounds or really harness their values and adaptability, their resilience into an asset?
I think my mum had close to 11 siblings, and her cousins also had 9 or 10 siblings. And each single one of them had an artistic career. And I think Vietnamese people by nature are so creative and so artistic. You can see that in our food, our fashion, our culture, our holidays, everything. Even from, degrees of separation of migrants. So I think, really double down on that and embrace it, because it's in your blood a lot of the time, and use that as a way to create your life's journey.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think leaning into that dual heritage, much like Brian has mentioned, we are so unique. We bring different perspectives to the world, and Australia being a very multicultural and diverse country, lean into that and don't be shy to embrace it. I think it's striking that balance though. Like I think sometimes you got to bring your authentic self to work, but also adapt to the workplace. I think it's you learn as you go along, but I think when it comes to less conventional paths, it is a lot trickier when you don't have role models that you see in that space. So if I take my career in government, for example, very few Vietnamese Australians and senior leadership. So for me, I was like, okay, where are we? And these are the people who are making policies and decisions and legislations for millions of Australians, but our voices are not represented. So, sort of me joining it and bringing that different lens and opening the eyes of my colleagues, and it became a peer experience and learning. I think that was extremely valued through my time, and I had been recognised for some of my work in government for doing that. I think once upon a time, I probably would have been shy to bring that Vietnamese self to my work and say, hang on a minute, like when you're, particularly during COVID, for example, or doing policies and informing the Premier's office about COVID lockdowns and things like that, hang on, why is your communications, blah, 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 engagement strategies not in language or blah, 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 all these things not thought about if that person with the diverse lived experience is in that role. So I would highly recommend leaning into that and using that as an experience, pivot your career. Like I know a lot of people who maybe in the corporate sector, banking, finance, who have really pivoted into, consulting or philanthropy, or have really jumped and leaned into that creative space, leaned into that philanthropic or community space, something that they've longed to do later in life. Don't be afraid to make that pivot and change, because as Brian said, every job that you go down opens 10 doors, and I think what we tend to make a mistake is to pigeonhole ourselves and not realising the potential for us to actually, that's a path that I've taken but doesn't define me in 10 years. So, be bold and make that change.
Sounds really great. Both of you mentioned about kind of leaning onto your sort of potential, and then your values and what you're good at, but also because many of our audience here either studying at the moment or early in their career, do you have any specific example of how they can harness that sort of cultural advantage, as well as how they can find their passion or what they're good at, and how they can have that confidence to really lean onto their own power?
Yeah, I was talking to some students in the foyer. I was saying that volunteer changed my life. I was a shy Vietnamese kid. Second in my family to go to university. I didn't have any professional networks. I didn't know where to start. So I joined uni. I was like, I need to put myself out there, and I really had to break from my bubble, join the student union, do whatever, join that weird sausage sizzle thing that you had to do, but orientation day, whatever it is. The people that I met from 15 years ago, I still am connected to now, and they've gone on to become managers and directors and CEOs, and to have that network now 10 years later, and also at that time I didn't have professional referees, so to have that volunteer job meant that I could put down my manager at the time, who was volunteering for that sausage sizzle, saying she did a great job, she rocked up on time. Those little things count, and I think it adds up over time, and people, I think, shy away from volunteering, maybe because it's not paid. And I'm not saying don't do unpaid work. I think if the time allows you to, it is a great way to get to know your local networks, the industries, and just build that the connections here locally.
What about you, Brian? Do you have any tips or advice? Trying to lean onto their own superpower.
I think really being conscious about, different cultures as well, and using that as a way to respect other cultures has really helped me, because a lot of the time it's this is an Australian way, this is Australian way. It's for me, my background was actually Vietnamese. My whole household is the opposite of this. And so to actually understand that and know that okay, this is probably the same for so many other people out there, and be open about that and learning has really helped me, I guess respect and bond with a lot of people and create meaningful relationships. So definitely, respect is a big thing.
Fantastic. Okay. The next question that I have, probably more for you, Brian, is about the. Actually, I think for both of you, is like one skill or like mindset that has really helped you to like, become successful in your own sort of journey. And particularly, like, is there any one particular like skill or mindset that you feel like often being overlooked, but really critical for Vietnamese Australians or like overseas Vietnamese in Australia, building their businesses or their career in Australia?
Yeah, I think it's emotional intelligence, and I know it's become a lot of a buzzword, but in Australia in particular, relationships is everything, networks is everything. To be able to, what sets apart a technical leader and a good leader that leads as an entire organisation would be down to that emotional intelligence. And I find some of the best people I've worked for and the best organisations I've worked for have people with high emotional intelligence, and I've been able to build that over the years. And it comes down to that empathy and that lived experience as well, and being able to lean into that and relate to others in a different way. We've all come from different walks of life and come without judgment. And I think people tend to be embarrassed to feel things and be vulnerable, but I think it's a really powerful asset to have as a leader and as an individual, to be able to be vulnerable, to be true to yourself, and then you start to see people start to trust you more, and then you can, I think it's a real skill, and I think I don't know so much, but I'm assuming, culturally, we don't really talk about our feelings. We don't. I think in Vietnam, the context of business there, maybe it's starting to embrace it a lot more, but I think for here, it's high EQ is definitely up there. So definitely work on that if you can.
Thanks, Leah. What about you, Brian? What do you think there's one skill or mindset that's often overlooked but critical for OVs to be successful in Australia?
Okay, and especially in starting your own business, I have an opinion on this, which is very similar. I'm actually going to double down on what Celia said. So a lot of the times I get asked, Brian, if you could work on one skill from the very beginning again and double down on that, what would it be? For me, it's something that I call stakeholder management. And especially if you were to ever go down the route of managing teams that scale up and down fast, clients across the world that scale up and down fast, investors that scale up and down fast, there is actually an art and a skill to managing these relationships and expectations. And it's something that a lot of people overlook because they look at numbers. I want to start my business because I want to retire and have financial freedom. And so the numbers mean so much to them, and they overlook the skill of stakeholder management. And what happens is that after 1, 2, 3, be it like 5 or 10 years, you're stuck with someone that you didn't manage expectations for. And they're suddenly expecting so much from you, and you've never talked about what that so much means. And so, word of caution, and something I wish I did from the beginning and focus a lot more on, is that stakeholder management.
Great. So we have talked about, like building your future, like you building your career path, and then also like exploring your passions, harnessing like your skills as someone with, dual cultural heritage. So now we're going to look ahead. What's an emerging industry or trend in Australia that, overseas Vietnamese should pay more attention to, and how they can prepare for that future? Yeah.
Okay, I'm a bit of a policy nerd. On Tuesday, the government released its budget. And I think that says a lot about the forecast of where Australia is going in the next 5 years. Obviously, the Australian government has its own, industry growth trends, and you can easily Google that and it will tell you 10 million different things. But this is what I'm seeing, being in the not-for-profit space, but also having worked from government. Australians are getting older, sicker, and living longer. And there's a serious shortage of people in healthcare and social services providing that care. And it's a real wicked problem because we're really struggling to find, it's not a glorifying job to look after someone in aged care, nursing, but it's an important job. And money, billions of dollars is going into this, and I think the Vietnamese community, we maybe it's a looked down upon, or whatever. I think it's still I think it's a very honourable thing to actually to dedicate your life to caring for someone. So I wish more of us leans into that. Being able to speak another language is a huge bonus. Teachers, there's a shortage of teachers in education, especially in regional Australia. So those are sort of the key areas. But obviously, Brian can talk more on the tech and space, but that is a whole nother can of worms. But if I was to say, from what I'm seeing, it's those sort of emerging fields. It's definitely the human services side, and it's watch that space. Though a caveat is, unfortunately, budget didn't disclose how much they are cutting in terms of migration intake, but they are predicting a massive cut. I think it was 225,000, which is significantly lesser, and it will continue to dwindle down in the next 5 years. So that is not great news for international students. It just means it's going to be more competitive, but that's where you need to really strategically align potentially. Is Australia the right place for you? Is there jobs? Where are the growth opportunities? And do your homework, not just assume that once I graduate I'll get a pathway in, because it is very competitive, and they are prioritising sort of skill shortage areas as well, and people, unfortunately, people with money. So, yeah, Brian, tell us about the tech world.
I'm not a policy nerd. I'm just like a normal IT nerd. I'm not going to talk about AI, just want to let you know. For me, and I think this is actually something that I want to give back to the Vietnamese community for as well. And it's not just because of my background. I think it's a cultural thing. There's a very overlooked industry inside creative design and media. And why I say that is because, you know, growing up in Australia, I see so many photographers, so many artists, so many people in the architecture realm that are Vietnamese. And so we have a knack for it from a data perspective. So for the technology world, for me, it's always about, can you do something better? And is the value of your problem big enough now and across the world and in many years? And so if all those things align, you know, usually it's a pretty decent idea to continue to research into that and become obsessed with that problem. And so, you know, in the tech industry, and especially in the startup industry, that's what we live and breathe and do all the time. So for me, you know, you can see tech giants like Facebook, TikTok, even Amazon to many extents double down on that sort of media, creative and design space. But if you think about advertising and all those amazing brands you see up there, that's also where a lot of money is going. And retail advertising media traditionally has been one of the most expensive and trickiest spaces. People have no idea how much money they're going to get if they put a billboard up in the airport, you know. And so there's so many amazing opportunities in that space that I strongly believe, you know, people in the Vietnamese community as well as the Australian community are starting to look at as well. I run a marketing company, by the way, so that's, yeah.
So we just learned that you have a like card.
No, like card is the marketing platform.
Fantastic. And also, like, just building on what Brian said as well, at 100-story building, so we are not-for-profit, running a program to help young people and children unlock their creative potential. We noticed that a lot of our young people and children, and because we work in the west of Melbourne, so a lot of the young people and children who live there are actually coming from Vietnamese background, Filipino, and other Southeast Asian backgrounds, and they have this already, like, just very deep creative, you know, like, spirit inside them already. But it's all about, like, you know, I think, like, in the media, in our industry as well, we often overlook, like, those sort of creative career over, like, you know, other ones, like in like engineering, tech, lawyer, doctor. That's what our parents want. So because we come very close to the conclusion of this panel, I'm going to ask our panelists one more question, which is, if each of you can leave us, you know, with a few thoughts and perhaps like one piece of advice that you wish someone had given you about, like, navigating life, career, entrepreneurship, or even like possible self-setting, like what I can be and what I can do to build a meaningful life in Australia, Vietnam and beyond, what would you give an advice?
It's such a silly one. Did anybody die? Like, that's my, like, did anyone die? No. Just do it. Like, you know, I think we get, I think that's self-disbelief, and that's holding ourselves back. It's probably our worst enemy in opportunities and putting ourselves out there. So I had to really self-talk myself a lot into things. I'm so glad I did, because a lot of those opportunities have opened many doors. So, yeah, try to shut down those negative thoughts. No one's dying, yeah. You'll be fine.
for me, I think ignore the white noise. There's a lot of stuff you see on social media about business owners and, you know, other people working jobs that might be dream jobs for you, but definitely stay true to yourself and ignore the white noise.
Fantastic. So thank you to our wonderful panelists and audience. So have a great afternoon, everyone. And if you're planning to attend the networking receptions, both Celia and Brian's will be around. So come and say hi and chat with them. Thank you.